years of crisis and deprivation and in their daily lives. Millions of Venezuelans fled repression and economic insecurity. Many made their home in the United States. Many wished to return. Their suffering was compounded by the devastating twin earthquakes on June 24th. Official statistics showed that some 4,500 people were killed, with 16,700 injured. Our hearts go out to those affected by this terrible natural disaster, and I encourage our government to continue to provide aid. I hope our witnesses will update us on how their families and their neighbors are faring. You know, for too long, the people of Venezuela have been denied the ability to enjoy their universal declaration, the universal human rights. Their own government repeatedly fails in its obligation to respect their rights. But theirs is not the only government complicit in rights violations. I believe ours is too. 9 years of harsh U.S. economic sanctions have had a demonstrably negative impact on the livelihoods of Venezuelans. Politicians in Washington arrogantly tell Venezuelans they must suffer violations of their economic and social rights as the only way to restore their civil and political rights. This is an insult to their dignity. This is wrong. Our policy must protect and defend all human rights of the Venezuelan people. On January 3rd, U.S. forces seized Nicolas Maduro. This military attack was illegal under the U.S. Constitution and the UN Charter. It should not have happened. Nevertheless, it is a fact. Maduro ran one of the most repressive regimes in the hemisphere. The International Criminal Court is investigating possible crimes against humanity committed under his rule. The UN fact-finding mission has documented such crimes. Maduro faces narco-trafficking charges in the United States, but where is the human rights accountability? Will the U.S. send him to The Hague for these crimes? Will the Venezuelan people get the justice they demand and deserve for the crimes committed against them? This is the key question. Who will decide the future of Venezuela? The Venezuelan people or the politicians in Washington? President Trump said that the United States would, quote, run Venezuela for the foreseeable future. As the New York Times reported, based on dozens of interviews, Secretary Marco Rubio, quote, effectively controls Venezuela's finances, the distribution of its natural resources, and its government. Officials call him the Viceroy, a term used in the imperial period. Secretary Rubio has laid out a three-phase plan: stabilization, economic recovery, and transition. Who remembers the China PNTR debate in 2000? The Clinton administration said political reform would flow from economic changes. It did not. Co-Chair Smith and I agreed on that. Now it appears that the Trump administration is following this same discredited path in Venezuela. Congress should press the administration not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Demand a roadmap for democratic transition with transparency. Insist on clear benchmarks. Restore constitutional order. Promises of elections are hollow without systemic reform. Venezuelans have seen how their votes can be hijacked without it. This will require dismantling of the security state, an independent judiciary, electoral reforms, lifting restrictions on civil society, respecting freedom of the press and expression, and transitional justice. This work should have already started. The United States has immense leverage right now, but is our government using it to improve the lives and liberties of the Venezuelan people? Or are U.S. officials using it to enrich oil executives, Qatari financiers, and themselves? Will the American politicians who spoke so righteously about democracy and human rights when Maduro was in power help the Venezuelan people attain these freedoms? Or will they stay silent while Trump and Rubio cut deals with the same regime they once called illegitimate? At its core, our policy toward Venezuela must address the aspirations of the Venezuelan people. They have suffered for far too long under their own corrupt government, the economic sanctions of a vindictive U.S. government, and now a national disaster. The path forward must put human rights first, all human rights. And I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. And at this point, I'm happy to yield to the distinguished co-chair of this commission, The Honorable Congressman Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, for your comments and for your opening statement and for this hearing. You know, for more than a quarter of a century, the people of Venezuela have endured one of the gravest humanitarian and human rights crises in the history of our hemisphere. Many thousands have been killed by the Chavez-Maduro dictatorship. Indeed, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights documented almost 7,000 extrajudicial killings in 2018 and 2019 alone. Thousands have been tortured and imprisoned. Millions have fled. Nearly 8 million displaced. Families have been torn apart by repression, violence, and economic collapse. And Chavez's money found its way into many elections throughout Latin America, propping up dictatorships, huge amounts of money and influence coming from him. And I find that appalling, and spoke out against it over and over and over again over the many years and I did chair the Human Rights Committee for a long time, and always was raising those questions. And thankfully, he's now hopefully going to face accountability for his crimes, especially in the area of illicit drugs. All of these horrors were driven, of course, by Chavez, and since then, the 2013 Maduro dictatorships, which of course have a close political, ideological, and military intelligence partnership with Cuba. Chavez liked to call Castro his mentor and father figure. And for Maduro, likewise, Castro was a father, teacher, and comandante. And I would note parenthetically that I, too, on Cuba, I have tried to get to Cuba prisons for decades. Fidel Castro, when I made the request repeatedly, over and over and over again, he said that I was a provocateur, along with Frank Wolf, who wanted to go and meet with political prisoners inside. We worked with Armando Valladares when he wrote his great book, Against All Hope, and talked about the pervasive use of torture by the Castro dictatorship inside. I went to the UN. We went to the Human Rights Council. They got a resolution passed to go and visit the prisons, UN that is. They wouldn't let me go. And everybody who came forward was retaliated against. They were promised in advance that wouldn't happen. So to have a Maduro, Maduro himself, to look up to such a heinous person as Fidel Castro for so long, and to be so influenced, as was Ortega and so many others in the hemisphere, that it's just appalling. You know, who you hang out with and who you admire and take money from, and you know, speaks volumes about who you really are. So thankfully, you know, he's hopefully going to face some very real accountability. As in Cuba, in Venezuela, a country rich in resources and educated, hardworking people, it was reduced to an impoverished dictatorship by socialists who came to power under the slogan, get this, of more democracy, which in practice meant zero democracy. This year marked the dramatic turning point. In January, Nicolas Maduro was arrested by U.S. forces, removed from power, and brought to the United States to face justice. Vice President Rodriguez assumed acting leadership, yet whether this leads to a genuine democratic recovery or another chapter of struggle remains an open question. It has not yet happened. Some prisoners have been released, while there are still many political prisoners. Whether Venezuela will become free and democratic depends on the Venezuelans, and hopefully our influence and the influence of like-minded democracies will have a good, positive role. Frankly, I think our Secretary of State is an outstanding leader, especially as it relates to human rights and democracy. He has been focused on Cuba forever and does a marvelous job on that. And he, too, I think, is hoping and doing what they can to try to make a difference. The people of Venezuela deserve democracy and human rights and to have those rights protected. Before the arrest of Maduro, our government has tried to promote freedom through various approaches, diplomacy, pressure, sanctions. None of it was successful. As the country navigates this transition, our goal must remain supporting conditions for Venezuelans themselves to restore an accountable government, independent institutions, a free and robust press, and economic opportunity. History shows that durable reform cannot be imposed from the outside, although it can be very seriously encouraged, and the U.S. can do much to help. Today, with the government in place with whom the administration has a working relationship, We can engage with them in support of stabilization and recovery, and of course, we press for concrete reforms, dismantling repressive structures so there's not a snapback to all of that, ensuring political prisoners are fully freed without reservations and restrictions. And frankly, they need their day. You know, one of the things that we saw in South Africa was a truth commission, which had a very laudable impact. And in El Salvador, I remember being very much a part of the hearings and going down to El Salvador when they had a truth commission to try to ferret out who it is that were committing the crimes and then get to the point where there's reconciliation in the country. Effective humanitarian response to the earthquake, or earthquakes, I shouldn't say just one, with faith-based groups and local communities demonstrates our partnership to help save lives while respecting sovereignty. You know, it's so important that we do everything we can to help them to get back on their feet. I mean, the loss of life, the number of missing, and the cruelty of being under a building for days. I can't even begin to imagine how horrible it is to suffer in such a way. And thankfully, some of our teams, including the group out of Fairfax County, went down and did tremendous work in trying to find and rescue individuals who were hurt and buried in buildings. We also need to learn from the errors of the Obama and the Biden administrations who attempted to impose narrow agendas on foreign countries by funding and empowering elite NGOs, which are often resented by the host countries. I'm hopeful that the Trump administration has learned that lesson. And we do need to provide international support. Humanitarian relief is, much has been done, much more has to be done so they can rebuild and become a thriving democracy. The people of Venezuela, and I know many, are amazing people. They have earned, through their suffering, they're entitled just by reason of who they are as human beings, fundamental human rights. And they did not get it in the past. God willing, they get it now.
Thank you very much. And now I want to introduce our witnesses. Marta Tinio Rodriguez is the founder and co-director of Justice, Encounter, and Forgiveness. At JEP, she worked closely with victims of politically motivated persecution in Venezuela, assessing privileged firsthand information provided directly by the victims and their families. Beatriz Borges Urrutia is the executive director of the Justice and Peace Center. She works to promote and defend democratic values, human rights, including women's rights, and a culture of peace. Laura Cristina Deeb is a Venezuelan program director at the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, where she works with partners in Venezuela and the region to advocate for democracy and human rights. Isabel Carlota Roby is the senior staff attorney for Latin America at the Robin and Ethel Kennedy Human Rights Center, where she leads strategic litigation and advocacy initiatives across the region, including in Venezuela, El Salvador, Guatemala, Brazil, and in Cuba. Andres Martinez Fernandez is the senior policy analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security. He leads the foundation's work on U.S. policy toward Latin America, conducting research on topics such as economic security and transnational organized crime. I want to welcome everybody here. We will begin with Ms. Rodriguez, who I know is online, and we will hope this all works. So I will yield to you. Host recording, we're not getting sound. Well, yeah, I think
we can have her unmute her microphone.
you have to unmute your
Her microphone is muted.
Someone said it takes a village.
Señor
Okay, there we go. Okay. Beautiful. Thank you. Yes.
Señor copresidente Smith, copresidente McGovern y honorables miembros de la comisión, les agradezco el honor de comparecer ante ustedes el día de hoy. Soy Marta Tineo y les hablo desde Caracas, Venezuela, con profunda gratitud por los esfuerzos que su país ha reunido en favor de nuestra causa y como testigo de una compleja trayectoria en la que el pragmatismo más riguroso se abraza con la esperanza. Los Estados Unidos y Venezuela comparten una historia profunda, cimentada en la defensa incansable de la libertad, la justicia y la democracia, una tradición que su nación ha sostenido históricamente y que en Venezuela hemos visto degradarse en las últimas décadas. Nuestra búsqueda de libertad es un eco de sus valores fundacionales y bajo el amparo de esa historia compartida acudimos a este recinto con la esperanza renovada, el que las voces de la sociedad civil y organizaciones defensoras de víctimas como la que hoy represento encuentren espacio en este hemiciclo es un testimonio vivo del compromiso genuino con la democratización, la seguridad y la paz de nuestro hemisferio. Con un espíritu constructivo, valoramos los hitos alcanzados durante este 2026, la excarcelación de un número importante de presos por razones políticas y luego la promulgación de la ley de amnistía que permitió que otros finalmente vieran concluidos procesos judiciales ha representado un alivio. Sin embargo, como observadores independientes que habitamos el terreno, al evaluar con rigor técnico estos procesos, constatamos que siguen existiendo desafíos que requieren atención, particularmente en lo que respecta a la transparencia. Las listas oficiales de beneficiarios no han sido entregadas a los organismos internacionales de protección de derechos humanos, ni puestas a la vista de defensores ni grupos de familiares, por lo que los anuncios oficiales no son verificables de forma independiente. Hemos constatado que 795 personas han salido de prisión política, pero solo una minoría obtuvo libertad plena por aplicación de la ley de amnistía. La mayoría de quienes han salido de prisión se mantienen con libertad condicionada y sometidos a procesos judiciales que violan las garantías al debido proceso. Reconocemos que las liberaciones han sido posibles gracias a sus gestiones y muestra resultados concretos en el desierto de una crisis de décadas, un punto de inflexión hacia la distensión que atesoramos con responsabilidad. Nuestra documentación indica que hoy en Venezuela se mantienen al menos 518 personas privadas de libertad por razones políticas. Dentro de este universo hay historias, familias y ausencias con daños irreversibles. Paralelamente, el andamiaje institucional sigue cerrado a la fiscalización internacional, mientras persisten leyes que asfixian el espacio cívico y estigmatizan el funcionamiento de las organizaciones no gubernamentales. Venezuela es un país devastado por décadas de erosión en su tejido político, económico y social. Somos conscientes de que una tragedia de esta magnitud no se supera en meses, ni puede ni debe depender exclusivamente de la política norteamericana. La construcción de Venezuela nos convoca a los venezolanos a ser artífices de nuestra propia realidad y es por eso que nos hacemos presentes ante este Congreso de visiones plurales y debates legítimos sobre la estrategia hacia nuestra región y consideramos fundamental que esa estrategia sea diseñada con un enfoque basado en los derechos humanos. El Estado de Derecho en Venezuela sigue cercenado por el debilitamiento institucional, restricciones al espacio cívico e impunidad. Las violaciones de derechos humanos, incluyendo torturas a presos políticos y sus familias, siguen ocurriendo y organismos internacionales señalan que constituyen crímenes de lesa humanidad debido a una política de Estado. Ante este panorama, es indispensable promover la participación significativa de las organizaciones venezolanas especializadas en derechos humanos que poseemos capacidades técnicas avanzadas en protección y defensa, lo que representa un valor estratégico para fortalecer un proceso genuino de estabilización, recuperación y democratización en el país, garantizando justicia para las víctimas. La sociedad civil venezolana está comprometida con una cooperación constructiva y ofrecemos a esta agenda binacional nuestra experticia para desatar los nudos del proceso de manera coordinada y armónica. Las nobles intenciones de la comunidad internacional podrán convertirse en un horizonte firme y sostenible, y para eso visualizamos 3 acciones concretas que pueden ejecutarse de forma inmediata. Primero, la liberación plena y definitiva de todos los presos políticos, civiles y militares, para lo cual ponemos a su disposición registros independientes como puentes de confianza. Segundo, la derogación por inconstitucionalidad de las leyes que restringen el espacio cívico. Y tercero, el desmontaje estructural de los aparatos de persecución que aún operan en el Estado. Los principios de libertad que los inspiran son los mismos que hoy custodian nuestra esperanza. Hoy nuestra petición es que sostengan con nosotros un compromiso firme que apueste por una transición real de las instituciones venezolanas, lo cual nos pondrá en camino hacia una justicia genuina, una reconciliación duradera y una libertad inquebrantable. Agradezco enormemente la atención que la Comisión me ha brindado y con gusto responderé sus preguntas.
Well, thank you very much, and we're going to ask Maureen Meyer with WOLA to translate for those of us who don't speak Spanish. So just make sure your mic is on, that's all. There you go.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and honorable members of the Commission, thank you for the honor of appearing before you today. My name is Marta Tineo, and I speak to you from Caracas, Venezuela, with deep gratitude for the efforts your country has marshaled on behalf of our cause, and as a witness to a complex journey in which the most rigorous pragmatism goes hand in hand with hope. The United States and Venezuela share a deep history, grounded in the tireless defense of freedom, justice, and democracy, a tradition your nation has historically upheld, and one that in Venezuela we have watched erode over recent decades. Our pursuit of freedom is an echo of your founding values, and under the shelter of that shared history, we come to this chamber with renewed hope that the voices of civil society and of victims' advocacy organizations like the one I represent today can find a place in this room is a living testimony to the genuine commitment to the democratization, security, and peace of our hemisphere. In that constructive spirit, we value the milestones achieved during this year, 2026. The release of a significant number of political prisoners, followed by the enactment of an amnesty law that allowed others to finally see their judicial proceedings concluded, has brought relief. However, as independent observers living on the ground, when we evaluate these processes with technical rigor, we find that challenges remain that require attention, particularly with respect to transparency. The official lists of beneficiaries have not been provided to international human rights bodies, nor made available to defenders or family groups, which means the official announcements cannot be independently verified. We have confirmed that 795 people have been released from political imprisonment, but only a minority obtained full freedom through the application of the amnesty law. Most of those released remain under conditional release and subject to judicial proceedings that violate due process guarantees. We recognize that these releases have been possible thanks to your efforts, and they show concrete results in the desert of a decades-long crisis, a turning point towards de-escalation that we treasure with a sense of responsibility. Our documentation indicates that today, at least 518 people remain deprived of their liberty in Venezuela for political reasons. Behind that number are stories, families, and absences that have caused irreparable harm. At the same time, the institutional apparatus that remains closed to international oversight, while laws persist that suffocate civil society and stigmatize the work of non-governmental organizations. Venezuela is a country devastated by decades of erosion of its political, economic, and social fabric. We are aware that a tragedy of this magnitude cannot be overcome in months, nor can it, nor should it, depend exclusively on U.S. policy. The reconstruction of Venezuela calls on us, Venezuelans, to be architects of our own reality. That is why we come before this Congress of plural visions and legitimate debates about the strategy toward our region, and we consider it essential that this strategy be designed with a human rights-based approach. The rule of law in Venezuela remains curtailed by institutional weakening, restrictions on civic space, and impunity. Human rights violations, including torture of political prisoners and their families, continue to occur, and international bodies have determined that they constitute crimes against humanity resulting from a state policy. Against this backdrop, it is important to promote the meaningful participation of Venezuelan organizations specialized in human rights, organizations like ours, which possess advanced technical capacities in protection and defense work. This represents a strategic asset for strengthening a genuine process of stabilization, recovery, and democratization in the country, while guaranteeing justice for the victims. Venezuelan civil society is committed to constructive cooperation, and we offer this binational agenda our expertise to untie the knots of this process in a coordinated and harmonious manner. For the noble intentions of the international community to become firm and sustainable horizon, we envision 3 concrete actions that can be implemented immediately. First, the full and definitive release of all political prisoners, both civilian and military, for which we place our independent registries at your disposal as a bridge of trust. Second, the repeal on the grounds of unconstitutionality of the laws that restrict civic space. And third, the structural dismantling of the apparatus of persecution that still operates within the state. The principles of freedom that inspire you are the same ones that today safeguard our hope. Our request is that you sustain with us a firm commitment to a real transformation of Venezuela's institutions, which will set us on a path towards genuine justice, lasting reconciliation, and unshakable freedom. I thank the Commission for its attention, and I will be glad to answer your questions.
Many thanks. Thank you. Ms. Borges.
Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, and distinguished members of this commission. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your long-standing commitment to the Venezuelan people. I want to begin recognizing two groups of Venezuelans, those who have spent years seeking justice for human rights violations, and those who today continue searching for loved ones beneath the rubble left by the June earthquake. At first glance, these appear to be different tragedies. They are not. One resulted from human actions and institutional failure, the other from a natural disaster. Both reveal the terrible cost of institutions that fail to protect their people. This is an unprecedented opportunity to help chase Venezuela's democratic future. To succeed, the transition must protect civil society, place victims at center, measure progress through concrete benchmarks, and ensure the meaningful participation of women. Venezuela is living through prolonged humanitarian, institutional, and political crises. While democratic change will take time, true priorities are already clear: protecting civil society and rebuilding democratic institutions. The June 24 earthquake made those priorities impossible to ignore. The earthquake did not create the Venezuelan crisis. They exposed it. They also revealed one of the Venezuelan greatest strengths, civil society. Across the country, local organizations, community leaders, faith-based groups, independent journalists, and media organizations, university, and the Venezuelan diaspora mobilized to save lives, document urgent needs, coordinate humanitarian assistance, and support affected communities. These capacities were built over the years of humanitarian emergencies, institutional fragility, and a context marked by the systematic criminalization and persecution for those who defend human rights and demand accountability. Today, Venezuelan civil society is one of the country's greatest democratic assets, built on trust, local knowledge, and community presence. Yet, Venezuelan civil and social infrastructure is at risk. Independent organizations operate with extremely limited resources while facing criminalization, intimidation, restriction on access to information, and increasingly hostile environment and legal frameworks that undermine the right to freedom of association. Protect civil space demands to then repealing the anti-NGO law. Protecting civil space is ultimately about making justice and democratic future possible. Years of systemic corruption has profoundly weakened public institutions. Corruption is on this scale, deepens inequality, undermines essential service, and disproportionately affects women, who often search for disappearing relatives, demand the release of loved ones, pursue justice, and carry the greatest burden of the humanitarian emergency. This creates an important opportunity for the Congress. As you consider initiatives as a PANA Act, I encourage you to promote a vision of recovery that goes beyond rebuilding physical infrastructure. Venezuela must also rebuild justice institutions, strengthen the rule of law, and restore public trust through trust, justice, reparation, and guarantee of no repetition. How will we know whether Venezuela is truly moving toward democracy? The Justice and Truth platform developed the Justice Thermometer, a practical framework that measures repression, civic space, judicial independence, accountability, and institutional reform. We are honored to submit this tool to the Commission as a practical reference for assessing progress. This is a pivotal moment for Venezuelans' democratic future. Let me close with 5 recommendations. Sustain independent civil society through flexible, long-term support. Support humanitarian assistance through credible local partners. Maintain international human rights accountability mechanism. Recognize women as a leader in recovery and democratic transition. And ensure that initiatives such as Habana Act support victims and rebuild not only infrastructure, but also justice and the rule of law. Members of the Commission, democracy cannot be rebuilt without civil society. Justice cannot be achieved without placing victims at the center. Recovery cannot succeed without rebuilding institutions. I look forward for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Deeb.
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and members of the Commission.
Pull that just a little closer there.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I will submit a longer statement for the record. Over the past 2 decades, Venezuelan authorities have gradually dismantled democratic institutions. The courts were captured, electoral authorities placed under executive control, and oversight bodies turned into instruments of abusive power. This enabled a policy of politically motivated persecution, arbitrary detentions, and forced disappearance, torture, that the UN fact-finding mission has found to constitute crimes against humanity. In July 2024, authorities declared electoral victory, although competent authority did not produce official tally sheets, while independently published results showed an opposition win by a wide margin. The crackdown in response to citizen protests, the most intense wave of repression in recent memory, included more than 2,000 detentions, among them children. On January 3rd of this year, the U.S. carried out a military operation in Venezuela and captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife. The operation was conducted without congressional authorization and raised serious concerns under both the U.S. Constitution and the UN Charter. While it broke political stagnation that followed the 2024 crackdown and created some openings, this has not yet translated into a genuine democratic transition. Since then, over 700 political prisoners have been released, some exiled leaders have returned, and civil society has cautiously reclaimed space. Key figures loyal to Nicolás Maduro have been moved to other positions within the same power structure. What has not changed is more fundamental. Hours after Maduro's capture, the Supreme Court invoked a concept that does not exist in the Venezuelan Constitution, a so-called forced absence, to install Delcy Rodriguez as acting president. Even under the most lenient interpretation, her term expired on July 2nd, with no election called. Over 500 people remain imprisoned on political grounds. Laws used to criminalize dissent remain in force. Political parties remain subject to judicial intervention. Some opposition figures are banned from office, and the courts and the electoral authority remain captured. Then came June 24th. The earthquakes struck a country already undergoing a protracted humanitarian emergency, the result of years of corruption and institutional dismantle, later aggravated by U.S. sectoral sanctions. Before the earthquake, the UN estimated that 7.2 million Venezuelans needed humanitarian assistance, but only 23% of the humanitarian response plan was funded. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, among them the health workers and engineers a disaster response required. The disaster met unequipped hospitals, chronic blackouts, and a rescue capacity weakened by years of mismanagement. It was ordinary citizens and independent organizations who carried the weight of that response. WOLA was there to witness it. The earthquake revealed how urgent the return to the rule of law is. Venezuelans need institutions capable of protecting them. We urge the U.S. Congress to call on the administration to use its engagement with the Venezuelan authorities to support concrete and verifiable steps. The unconditional release of political prisoners, the repeal of the anti-NGO law, and other laws that have been used to criminalize dissent, full territorial access for international human rights mechanisms, such as the Inter-American Commission and the UN Fact-Finding Mission, the restoration of media freedoms, a credible participatory roadmap to restore constitutional order, and ensure transparency and public accountability over humanitarian aid and reconstruction funds. We also call on Congress to keep funding human rights and democracy programs. Congress did this with the $50 million appropriated in Venezuela for Venezuela in fiscal year 2027, and with the funds proposed by the House Foreign Aid Bill for 2027. We ask Congress to exercise its oversight authority over the Venezuela oil proceeds held by the U.S. Department of the Treasury, as well as over the use of foreign and humanitarian assistance resources. And we ask Congress to keep raising concerns about democracy and human rights in Venezuela, as well as of the rights of Venezuelans, migrants, and refugees in the U.S. Venezuelans have the right to freely elect their leaders, and they have high expectations of the role the United States can play in supporting that goal. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roby.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Co-Chairman McGovern, Co-Chairman Smith. Members of the Commission, I will address the human rights situation in Venezuela, focusing on victims' access to justice, including international mechanisms, and the urgent need for an orderly transition to democracy and accountability, made all the more pressing by the severe earthquakes that struck Venezuela on June 24, 2026. The catastrophic June 24 earthquakes add to an already dire political and humanitarian crisis, creating an unprecedented emergency amid repression, mass migration, and entrenched corruption. This crisis is unfolding squarely within an authoritarian context characterized by repression and state control. It is magnifying the regime's incapacity to meet basic needs and exposing its inability to plan or carry out reconstruction, further strengthening the case for a prompt democratic transition. Now, in a functioning state with a genuine rule of law, judicial guarantees and due process serve as essential limits on a state's punitive power. In an authoritarian setting like Venezuela, the individual is at the mercy of the authorities, which uses its penal system to develop a state policy of repression that criminalizes and persecutes dissident and critical voices or anyone who challenges the spheres of power. Gross human rights violations in Venezuela are not incidental or isolated phenomena, but a deliberate and adaptive strategy of state repression. Arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearances, sexual violence, extrajudicial executions are embedded in the country's political order and have been calibrated over time to neutralize dissent, consolidate power, and project strength. For example, following the July 28, 2024 presidential elections, Venezuelan authorities and state-sponsored civilian collective or colectivos carried out widespread abuses, killing 25 protesters and bystanders, arbitrarily detaining thousands, and systematically using enforced disappearances as a core tool of political repressions. Our organization's 2025 report, which we have submitted in advance for the record, shows how enforced disappearances are used as a tool of control to stabilize power, particularly during electoral periods when spheres of power are challenged. Enforced disappearances, as we know, precipitate other grave human rights violations, including violations of the rights to life, personal liberty, denial of due process, and practices of torture. Despite the severity of these crimes, the state authorities tasked with investigating and prosecuting them fail to fulfill their duties. A 2024 report by the expert panel on Venezuela of the Organization of American States found that the Venezuelan state failed to initiate judicial proceedings in 53% of the cases reviewed and secure convictions in only 6%. Findings from international mechanisms converge on the same conclusion. Domestic avenues for justice are effectively closed. This is because Venezuela's judiciary is not independent but instrumental to the repressive apparatus. It aids and abets gross human rights violations rather than checking them. The fact-finding mission concluded that the justice system has made, quote, an essential contribution in implementing the state policy of quashing opposition. Recent changes to the judiciary are merely cosmetic. They retain key figures of the repressive apparatus, which remains intact even after Maduro's removal. The fact-finding mission has also repeatedly stated that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela, particularly the crime of persecution. The International Criminal Court opened a formal investigation in 2021, and this investigation remains ongoing. And while public narrative and proceedings before and after Maduro's removal have often focused on drug trafficking links, that must not obscure ongoing impunity for crimes against humanity. The impunity gap further enables other crimes. The importance of accountability efforts at the international level cannot be overstated. Victims rely on international mechanisms to obtain justice, and therefore such mechanisms must be supported, not attacked or weakened. Justice is intrinsically linked to democracy. There can be no real justice in Venezuela without a democratic transition. Victims have no prospect of redress under a current authoritarian system whose leaders, by all indications, are implicated in the chain of command responsible for these crimes. The United States and the international community must choose whether it will support an orderly, rights-based transition, help finance the reconstruction of Venezuela, or continue to support and finance an authoritarian regime. Thank you.
Thank you, and Mr. Martinez-Fernandez, welcome back. Just make sure that you got to have the mic a little bit close, yeah, otherwise it.
Co-Chair Smith, Co-Chair McGovern, and esteemed members of this commission, thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify. My name is Andres Martinez-Fernandez, and I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. Since January of this year, Venezuela has seen a dramatic, if incomplete, shift away from the repressive narco-dictatorship that once dominated life in the country. This is a reality that many in the world had written off as a realistic possibility following over 2 decades of authoritarian consolidation in Venezuela. However, Venezuela is now living under a different reality thanks to President Trump's pressure campaign against the Maduro regime and successful January 2026 capture of Nicolas Maduro. The recent earthquakes in Venezuela offer an important reminder of both the consequences of corrupt socialist dictatorial rule in Venezuela, as well as the benefits of direct U.S. engagement, which has been enabled by President Trump's policies. Undoubtedly, the scale of the recent tragedy reflects the underlying failures and corruption of Venezuela's socialist system under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro. Rampant corruption, persistent economic crises, have hollowed out emergency services and even construction activity and repairs, leaving the country far more vulnerable to natural disasters like this. The bright spot is that where once the Venezuelan regime actively shunned offers of U.S. humanitarian aid and disaster assistance, the U.S. has now been able to aggressively deploy life-saving disaster aid and support to the Venezuelan people. And not only the U.S. government's efforts, but also private and religious organizations like Samaritan's Purse that are today driving essential resources to aid Venezuela. Through engagement, the Trump administration's policy in Venezuela has made major strides towards dismantling the regime's repressive apparatus. This includes recent political amnesty, release of political prisoners, and incremental progress toward removing the historical repression of press freedoms. Another critical human rights achievement of the Trump administration's engagement is the ousting of foreign regimes that have not only bolstered the former Maduro regime, but also acted as a key architect of the repression of the Venezuelan people. Indeed, until January, thousands of Cuban agents were deployed to Venezuela to target opposition figures, quell dissent in the armed forces, and even directly carry out torture of the Venezuelan political prisoners. Thanks to President Trump's actions and engagement, Cuban agents have effectively been ousted from Venezuela, removing a key pillar of support for the Maduro regime's repressive apparatus. Without a doubt, additional progress is needed along the transition process, particularly around the implementation of an electoral timeline, total restoration of political rights, release of remaining political prisoners, and reform of democratic institutions. The full restoration of democracy through free and fair elections in Venezuela is the best guarantee against the country's potential backsliding towards repressive authoritarianism. At the same time, the Trump administration is right to pursue an initial stabilization effort focused on underlying economic and institutional conditions. We must recognize that for millions of Venezuelans who have faced years of extreme poverty, malnutrition, the most important human rights concern is the restoration of basic economic stability and well-being. Indeed, even under the Maduro regime, polling consistently showed that the main concerns of the Venezuelan people stemmed from the dire economic realities that they faced. And similarly, upwards of 70% of Venezuelan migrants cited the economic crisis as their motivation for leaving the country. It is therefore not only appropriate, but essential that the Trump administration also treat economic stabilization as a top priority, not only for the sake of the Venezuelan population, but also for the sake of hemispheric stability. There are already important marks of progress and optimism on this front. Venezuela's oil industry is showing signs of renewed activity and growth as the United States maintains critical oversight over oil revenue, ensuring it is reinvested into Venezuela rather than being siphoned off by corrupt officials. Concerted U.S. engagement can and is bringing about the dismantling of the authoritarian apparatus, and the stabilization of the economy will also facilitate continued progress towards these ends. Congress can empower these efforts by ensuring robust resources are available for humanitarian assistance and U.S. Southern Command, while maintaining calls for respect and protections of human rights. Thank you for your invitation, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I got a ton of questions, but I'm going to yield to Co-Chair Smith first to ask his questions. And let me just say to the people that are standing, I wish this were a bigger committee hearing room, but it's not. But you're more than welcome to take some of these chairs if you'd like to sit, but you just can't ask any questions, all right? So let me yield to Co-Chair Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you all for your testimonies, and I do sense, and we all feel a sense of optimism that, as you pointed out, Andres, in your testimony, that 92% of the people are grateful to President Trump for what he's done, and that was a very, very significant poll done in January. And also, that same poll found that 72% thought that Venezuela was moving in the right direction. So there is an opportunity here, a pivot, and hopefully it will be fully realized by everyone there and everyone who supports the Venezuelan people, including U.S. Congress, both sides of the aisle. I'll just ask a few questions, if I could. One, if you could speak to the issue, I mean, several of you have talked about the remaining political prisoners, and I'm wondering if you could speak to what the, obviously it wasn't Maduro himself that did all of it. He had a very, very well-organized security apparatus, including military and police, who have committed heinous human rights crimes, particularly torture and death. Are they still in place, as far as you know, ready to reemerge if the opportunity were to manifest itself? And I'll never forget, I worked a lot on the Bosnia and the invasion by Milosevic in the Balkans. And one of the problems with when they were saying people could reintegrate and all this other stuff, when there was a genocide committed in Srebrenica, and I went there, worked on those issues constantly, the people said my next door neighbor was the very same person that was torturing and killing people, and he had a police uniform on at the time. And I just hope that, those who have committed those crimes will be held to account, and we need to really strongly demand that on behalf of the people, and particularly on behalf of the victims, but meanwhile, making sure the people that are still incarcerated are left out. Secondly, if you could speak to Maria Machado, whether or not she should return, would that be helpful? I think the world of her. I think we all do. So certainly the Nobel Peace Prize Committee thought so too. So, I think she is a very, very powerful force. So if you could speak to that. Thirdly, the church. Nobody did mention the church, and the church is very robust in Venezuela. It's usually the church that's leading the cause. They are too, on human rights and democracy and respect for the human person from womb to tomb. And so if you could speak to the role the church could play now, both the Catholic and the evangelicals and all the church individuals there. The issue of trafficking persons. I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. I've written 5 anti-human trafficking laws, but that was our landmark law. And as you know, Venezuela has been a Tier 3 egregious violator since 2014 on the Tier 3 list of worst of the worst. Maduro and others, there's the gold mining in the south, there's where people are exploited, but sex and labor trafficking, especially sex trafficking, is off the charts for Venezuelan women and children. I would hope that we would step up and encourage and work with the government to just stop that. I mean, the victims, it's lifelong. We have a bill that I thought would be up this Monday, but it's going to be up very soon, that I've authored. It's a bipartisan bill. Very few bipartisan things these days, but it is. We named it after Frederick Douglass, but it goes to the next level of trying to combat human trafficking. And Kawisi Mafumi is my Democrat co-sponsor. We're working hand in glove on it. So I'm just asking you, on the trafficking piece, we need to admonish this government to say, okay, Tier 3, you go through the list of what they didn't do. Maduro enabled it all. It's about time they stepped up and said, okay, for the sake of our women and our children, we're going to protect them, and we're going to go after the traffickers, whether it be the gangs or whoever it might be, and we're going to protect. The 3 Ps, protection, prevention, and prosecution of the traffickers. They are Tier 3. You get off Tier 3 by deeds, and they can be sanctioned, as other countries have been sanctioned as well. Finally, I just want to ask about I mentioned the church. That's enough, because I don't want to ask too many questions. But if you could speak to those issues, and I appreciate the chairman allowing me to go first, because I do have to leave, and I thank you for that courtesy, but whoever would like to start first. And maybe if you could all, are you grateful to Trump or not? Because he did get a lot of criticism for that. I thought it was an outstanding move. Obviously, Maduro had a pending indictment against him that was very real. I read the indictment from cover to cover. He was a trafficker in all kinds of things, but drugs including, and that's what he was indicted on by a grand jury.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for your questions. And also, I want to recall that Venezuela is a really complex crisis, and the response should be also multidimensional and in a complex way that address the humanitarian, the political, the electoral, the human mobility crisis in a simultaneous way. And it's important, it's complex, and we are really grateful for this space to discuss that. Regarding the first questions about indicators, the tool that we present to you, to this commission, the thermometer, is produced by a platform called Justice and Truth. There are more than 20 organizations that we examine all the benchmarks about justice, civil society, reforms, institution, repressions, and in the majority of the indicators, there are still on red. There are not plenty of advance, and it's important to still working on that. That's why focus on rule of law and institution is so important. And civil society provide that information with technical indicators, with measures, and with when I backlash, we say it, but when also there is advance, as Marta informed, we also say that information and recognize that. About the political democratic leadership, I think is important for all Venezuelans to recover the political and civil rights. And that includes go back to Venezuela and participate in elections and not be persecuted for demanding your rights. And that is important, and that's a big, important indicator that we are going forward to democracy. About church, I mentioned in my speech, yes, a civil society is the great strength of Venezuela, even churches and volunteers, and the humanitarian structure is active, but also is working under very high risks and also with extremely low resources. And that's why I think this space is so important to see that capacity of Venezuelans has to recover Venezuela by ourselves, but also with your help and the international community. And about the traffic, and I think it's a very, very important topic, sometimes invisibilized by the situation, the multiple crises, but that's why it's important to understand the gender dimensions and the vulnerable populations in Venezuela and how are affected for this practice of modern slavery. And also the trafficking is something that is being aggravated for the human mobility crisis, the humanitarian crisis, and now with the earthquake. It's important to focus in the institutionality, but also to have a humanitarian response for this crime and human rights violation that is aggravated for the complex situation. And I think we are here, and this is an open door for this conversation that involves Venezuelan, but should involve United States, should involve Venezuelan, and should involve international mechanism of protection and the international community. I think it's so difficult. We have through so many pain and very difficult situation. We are feeling that pain right now with the earthquake in Venezuela. We need help for the US, for the international community, and for us who likes and love Venezuela.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your questions. I will address the first one because I think it's crucial on whether there have been changes within the administration. And that's why in my opening statement, I mentioned that there have been changes within the same power structure, but those changes have not meant a real transformation of power. And I would just mention a few of these actors, the person that used to be the Minister of Defense now is the Minister of Agriculture, who is Vladimir Padrino Lopez. Diosdado Cabello remains the Minister of Interior and Defense. And not only that, but Civil Protection or Protección Civil, the organism in charge of responding to the earthquakes, is underneath that structure. So it responds to the Minister of Interior and Defense. Members of the Direction of Military Counterintelligence, like Gran Cuarteaga, who has been named by the UN fact-finding mission directly, he remains in place. So that's why we continue saying that these changes need to be real and transformative and not just cosmetic changes. When it comes to the return of Maria Corina Machado, she, as many other members of the opposition, have been denied the right to political participation and the right to even human mobility. As a citizen, there shouldn't be a restriction for her return and for political participation in the same conditions as any other Venezuelans that want to participate. When it comes to the church, the Catholic Church, as you mentioned, and many others, but in particular, Catholic Church in Venezuela has a large presence all across the country. And they have been able to see firsthand some of the human rights violations that have been impossible to document in other areas of the country. So I think that they play an important role, A, on supporting, putting pressure for the release of political prisoners, but B, also in terms of what will follow in a transitional justice process, the reconciliation. I think they play a crucial role. And lastly, thank you for bringing the issue of human trafficking, because there's one element that I think this commission should look into, which is the illegal mining and the role of the U.S. The U.S. has granted 3 general licenses on oil, General License 51B, 54A, and License 55. we have risen concerns about how this licenses can have an impact on the supply chain transparency, sanctions evasion, environmental damage, and the potential legitimation of criminal extraction networks. These networks, some of them actually work by doing human trafficking in these areas and sexual exploitation, and it is important that the U.S. Does not support either if it's tangentially with these licenses, human trafficking and other human rights violations.
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. I will address question number 1 and question number 2. I think it's extremely important to reiterate the fact that in Venezuela, under this authoritarian and criminal regime, there is no prospect for justice. So this means that most of the perpetrators remain in places of power. And this is extremely dangerous. I will give you an example. General González López, who right now is the Minister of Defense, used to be the director of the SEBIN from 2019 to 2024. SEBIN, together with the Directorate of General Military Counterintelligence, is one of the bodies that disappears people, tortures people the most. In the report that we have submitted, you will see that these are the two bodies, together with the National Guard, the Bolivarian Guard, that has enforcibly disappeared Venezuelans and foreigners the most since 2018, when enforced disappearance became a central tactic for sustaining power in this regime. This only gives you an example of the world of appearance of this regime. This is a regime that lives in a world of appearance that wants to pass as a reality. When they have farcical elections, they call that the highest form of democracy. When they ban freedom of expression, they call that the highest form of freedom. When they use the law in an arbitrary manner, they call that the application of the law. It's all false. It's all based on lies. And this is the exact same thing that they are doing now while they are recycling people and changing the roles. This is the exact same thing that happened with Delcy Rodriguez. So we cannot make a distinction between Maduro and Delcy Rodriguez. It's a continuation of the same authoritarian and criminal regime. And this is the regime that the Trump administration at the moment is dealing with, and it seems to be supporting. Venezuelan people have been trying to affirm their dignity since at least 2014, with continued protest, voting, trying to change leadership, and this has not been possible, and they have paid a really high price. Detentions, tortures, and forced disappearance that amount to crimes against humanity. For these victims of crimes against humanity, it's impossible, as I had said in my initial remarks, to obtain justice in Venezuela. The judiciary is not independent. It's an instrument of the executive. It's an instrument of the regime that is right now in power. That is one first thing that needs to be very clear, because we have talked a lot about possible changes, like the amnesty law, for example. Yes, there is an amnesty law, it is true, but a lot of the people who obtain freedom through that amnesty law are still subjected to restrictions on their freedom. I'll give you an example. Rory Branker, he is a journalist who in 2025 was detained and enforcibly disappeared for 6 months. His case is profiled in that report that we submitted as well. He is now free, but what does freedom mean? If he is banned from leaving the country, he has to periodically present in front of a court with the added risk of being detained again. It's not full freedom. I'll give you another example. Emirlendris Benitez. She was detained in 2018. She was disappeared. She was tortured to the point that she suffered a miscarriage and lost her baby. She's 45 years old, and she's on a wheelchair. as a result of the torture she suffered. She was condemned to 30 years in prison. She was denied the amnesty. More than 19,000 people have been arbitrarily detained in Venezuela for political reasons since 2014. This is the regime the United States is dealing with at this moment. It's a criminal authoritarian regime. And these people continue in place regardless of the fact that Maduro is right now in jail here in the United States. The system continues and survives without Maduro. Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello, they all continue in place, and they are all implicated in the chain of command of crimes against humanity in Venezuela. And I hope that's very clear for this commission. Regarding Maria Corina Machado, as every other Venezuelan, she has the right to return to her country and exercise her political rights. Thank you.
So just on starting with that last point on Maria Corina Machado, I echo her obvious rights to return to Venezuela and the appropriateness of that. I do recognize, I think, some of the concerns of the administration of how that happens to ensure maximum security for her and stability around that event, which would be a very substantial event politically for Venezuela. I think her return to that country, and I think that's where a lot of the caution likely stems from, as far as ensuring that when she does return, particularly that there's no threat of violence, which, as was mentioned, we still, while we have a significant transition, I think a significant progress as far as changing the behavior of the regime. There's still a lot of the same actors in place, and there's still informally a lot of these groups like colectivos and others that can act in a way that could very much threaten Maria Corina, and I think she would be a priority target for a number of groups within Venezuela. Beyond that, the church is absolutely a critical actor within this recent tragedy in Venezuela. It's acted not only through the institution of the Catholic Church, but also through numerous organizations. I mentioned Samaritan's Purse and other faith-based groups, many of which based in the United States, which have been very proactively engaged in Venezuela on this crisis. And that's something that, for a lot of these groups, would not be something that they would be engaging in physically on the ground in Venezuela under the conditions that we had just a year ago, because of the concerns about their own safety, being either imprisoned or targeted with political charges, as we've seen against Americans in the past in Venezuela. So I think that's also a very important item to note, and they are filling in, both the United States, these organizations, the church, are filling in, helping to fill in a critical gap that the government in Venezuela has failed to address, which is the basic needs of safety and security of the Venezuelan people. While I think we're moving, the administration's policies are moving in the direction where we can see a restoration of those guarantees, we're clearly not there yet, and I don't think we should expect that after decades of the consolidation and hollowing out of an authoritarian infrastructure within Venezuela.
Thank you.
I think Marta, who's on,
Sure.
yeah, did she hear the question, or? Okay, yeah, all right, so why don't you get to, and we'll yield to Marta.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Me importa mucho hablar con ustedes en esta ocasión sobre la condición de quienes se encuentran privados de libertad por razones políticas actualmente en Venezuela.
Thank you. I had wanted to add a little bit of comments on the situation of political prisoners in the country and people that remain detained.
Las condiciones de reclusión en los centros de detención en Venezuela han alcanzado un punto crítico que vulnera cualquier estándar de dignidad humana. consolidando un patrón de tratos crueles, inhumanos y degradantes. La crisis de salud es alarmante. No solo se niega atención médica oportuna a pacientes con patologías crónicas, sino que existen denuncias graves sobre la administración de sustancias desconocidas que comprometen severamente la integridad de los detenidos.
The detention conditions in Venezuela have reached a critical moment that vulnerates any standard on human dignity. It represents a pattern of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. The health situation in particular is alarming. It is not just denying people timely medical attention, including people with chronic illnesses, but also there are complaints about serious violations of like giving people unknown substances, unknown medication that also can impact their health. So like the failure to administer the right medications for individuals that are suffering from chronic illnesses.
Este deterioro se agrava por una gestión institucional que responde con represión violenta ante cualquier solicitud básica de los detenidos. Es alarmante que peticiones de subsistencia como agua y alimentación sean sofocadas mediante el uso de gases lacrimógenos dentro de los recintos penitenciarios. Esta respuesta desproporcionada especialmente es grave en casos de presos políticos que, de nuevo, solicitan alimentos, y hay que recordar que hay reportes de presos políticos que han perdido incluso 30 kilos de peso por razones de desnutrición dentro de los centros penitenciarios.
This deterioration is worsened by the institutional response, which is a lot of violent repression, including when prisoners are asking for basics such as food and water, or unsanitary, like complaining about the unsanitary conditions, and they are often violently repressed, including using tear gas against them. And I think this is also just the broader situation of political prisoners. It's worth mentioning that some have lost up to 30 pounds because of lack of adequate medicine and also food and water.
A esta crisis se suma la incertidumbre sobre la integridad estructural de los centros penitenciarios tras los recientes terremotos. Hasta la fecha, las autoridades no han informado si se realizaron las inspecciones técnicas pertinentes, a pesar de los reportes sobre daños significativos en las instalaciones. Los reclusos fueron evacuados momentáneamente a espacios abiertos y luego fueron obligados a regresar a áreas comprometidas. Ante este riesgo inminente, los detenidos iniciaron manifestaciones para exigir condiciones mínimas de seguridad, las cuales fueron sofocadas con violencia, dejando un saldo de 7 detenidos actualmente, de quienes no se conoce su paradero y las condiciones en las que se encuentran.
It's worth also saying that the situation is worsened now after the earthquakes. We do not know if the government has done any evaluation of the safety of the prisons that were damaged during the earthquake. We have prisoners that were forced to evacuate prisons and then put back into them, and there's no clarity of whether these are safe structures, and there has been concern that people that are seeking to denounce the concerns about the safety, physical safety of prisons have now been repressed, and there are 7 people that have been reported detained as a result of these questioning of the prison conditions since the earthquakes.
Y finalmente, en cuanto a la aplicación de la ley de amnistía, debo decir con absoluta responsabilidad que ha sido un proceso marcado por la revictimización y la discrecionalidad. Si bien celebramos profundamente cada reencuentro familiar, cuando analizamos esto con una mirada técnica, nos damos cuenta que el proceso ha sido profundamente insuficiente. El problema central es que la ley de amnistía ha funcionado en la práctica como una medida cosmética diseñada para aliviar la presión internacional, pero no para saldar la deuda de justicia que el Estado tiene con las víctimas. Lamentablemente, desde el inicio fue un mecanismo de propaganda política. Desde su enunciado se hablaba de superar 27 años de violencia política en Venezuela, pero desde que veíamos el cuerpo normativo nos dábamos cuenta que muchísimos prisioneros iban a ser doblemente castigados porque siendo excluidos del marco de aplicación de esta norma.
I think it's also just wanted to talk about the amnesty law, which is resulting in re-victimization for different people and is also not sufficient in terms of the law. We certainly celebrate the release of all of the people that have been released, but make clear that this is an incomplete legal framework. That was also done in part, we would call it a cosmetic changes to please the international community regarding the situation in Venezuela, but not necessarily truth or justice for those that have been victims of political imprisonment. It's sort of like we're talking about 26 years of repression that needs to do a broader review of the legal framework, not just what we've seen so far.
Thank you. So I still have a lot of questions, but I'm going to yield to my colleague, Debbie Wasserman-Schultz from Florida, who's on a tight time schedule, so I want to give her a chance to ask some questions, but thank you for your patience. I yield to my colleague.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both co-chairs. I'm proud to be a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and proud of both of your leadership. I represent one of the largest Venezuelan communities in the United States. Many of my constituents fled the brutal repression of Chavez and Maduro, and most of them were glad to see Maduro captured and face justice. But the situation on the ground in Venezuela, as our experts here have detailed, the political repression, the corruption, the humanitarian disaster, has not remotely improved. The failed response by the Venezuelan regime to the disastrous earthquakes only demonstrates what little regard Delcy Rodriguez and her unelected cronies have for Venezuelan lives. And it underlines the importance of refocusing our engagement around restoring democratic, accountable, responsive institutions. Democracy, human rights, and rule of law are a necessary precondition to economic recovery, not a nice-to-have, they are a must-have. And until the conditions on the ground improve, it is absolutely unacceptable for the United States to deport hardworking, law-abiding Venezuelans back there to face backbreaking repression and gut-wrenching poverty. My first question is for Ms. Roby. What were the findings of the UN fact-finding mission on crimes against humanity in Venezuela, and was Maduro the sole perpetrator of those crimes?
Thank you so much for your question. First of all, I would like to highlight what an important role the UN fact-finding mission has had in Venezuela in documenting the crimes against humanity, how much that information has been used for the investigation at the International Criminal Court, which I will also mention because I think it's extremely important to mention after the op-ed that Secretary Rubio published on Monday, but also for foreign courts. The fact-finding mission has established, first of all, that crimes against humanity are committed in Venezuela and continue to be committed in Venezuela, has established a chain of command that go from medium to high officials in Venezuela and implicate high officers in Venezuela. They recently published a report on the National Bolivarian Guard, which I invite you to read. It's very exhaustive and really shows and explains the role that the National Bolivarian Guard has in the repression system. This is something that we also explain in our report on enforced disappearance, where essentially 4 bodies, security bodies, take on the repressive tactics. The National Directorate for Military Counterintelligence, the HESIM, the SEBIN, these are military intelligence bodies, the National Bolivarian Guard, and also the National Bolivarian Police. The fact-finding mission has established that persecution, political persecution, is the main crime against humanity being committed in Venezuela. And this is important because persecution is an umbrella. It's an international crime that is an umbrella and that covers other international crimes, including torture, enforced disappearance, sexual violence, etc. So the state of Venezuela, the perpetrators in Venezuela, torture people for political reasons. They imprison people for political reasons. They forcibly disappear people for political reasons. And this is a state policy. This is not random. This is a generalized, systematic practice.
And still ongoing.
It's still ongoing, and it's an attack against the civilian population. So we essentially have a state with all its machinery and punitive power that is attacking a civilian population and committing crimes against humanity. And this hasn't stopped just because the United States extracted Maduro and brought it to the United States.
Thank you.
And that is essential.
Thank you. Ms. Dibb, in your testimony, you point out that accountability for these abuses of power is essential to a democratic transition. And to date, those abuses have not abated. Laws criminalizing dissent have not been repealed. There's no roadmap to restore order and respect for human rights. And nevertheless, President Trump decided to lift sanctions on the regime, giving up immense leverage in exchange for what I can see as zero concessions. That includes individual sanctions on the very people responsible for Venezuela's collapse and repression. I don't really understand how lifting sanctions on Delcy Rodriguez's personal bank accounts will improve Venezuela's overall economy. So can you explain why we can't just simply lift sanctions on Venezuela like President Trump has done, flood the regime with money, and expect conditions to improve on their own?
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's important to start by separating or making a distinction between individual sanctions and sectoral sanctions. WOLA has been supportive of sanctions against people that have committed gross human rights violations, the Global Magnitsky Act, et cetera. And we have been more critical of sectoral sanctions because of the humanitarian impact, right? But the first thing that I want to say about this is that there's not a single view on sectoral sanctions when it comes to Venezuela. This is a highly controversial issue in the country. But there are different elements to consider. First, when it comes to the individual sanctions, we have the same questions that you posed. We think that our institutional position is that individual sanctions should be lifted, balancing this democratic benchmarks, which again, we haven't seen. But then when it comes to the sectoral sanctions, first, it's important to consider that the humanitarian emergency started before financial and sectoral sanctions were imposed, including the ones on oil. And this was said by the Secretary General of the UN in 2016. Ban Ki-moon already classified the situation in Venezuela as a complex humanitarian emergency. The second is that although, again, as we have said, we are critical of the sectoral sanctions, but lifting sanctions alone will not solve the issue of systemic corruption. In Venezuela, there's the law of the budget, or it would be the equivalent to the law of appropriations here in the US, is not public. So we don't know what's the budget. We don't know what is the public spending in Venezuela. And the central bank only after January 3rd started to publish some data. So that gives you an idea of the lack of accountability and transparency that there is in Venezuela. So my point being, yes, sectoral sanctions have caused damage, but lifting them needs to come hand in hand with meeting this democratic benchmarks.
Right, which has not happened.
That hasn't happened, and since January, OFAC has granted the largest set of general licenses. That includes licenses for oil commerce, for goods and services needed for oil production, for mining, aerial transportation, communications, and even the eventual debt restructuring. So this has been the largest sanctions relieved since sectoral sanctions were first imposed.
Thank you. And I have one more quick one. Thank you so much. Mr. Martinez-Fernandez, your testimony provided a significant amount of detail on the unimaginable scale of damage from the recent earthquakes in Venezuela. And we know there's thousands dead, thousands more still missing, and many of those likely dead, billions of dollars in damage. Your testimony also cites, quote, major strides towards reducing the regime's apparatus, but the regime remains in place. It appears that Delcy Rodriguez's primary focus after the earthquakes was shutting down internet access and communications, and that likely raised the death toll. And obviously, just the very way that both the Maduro regime and the Rodriguez regime, extension of the Maduro regime's oppression, and the stealing of Venezuelan wealth, once the most prosperous country in the region, probably beyond the United States, made investments in infrastructure and the kind of safe structures that should have existed impossible. Based on the extent of damage from these earthquakes and the regime's lack of capacity to respond, do you agree that that constitutes a disaster that should merit the redesignation of TPS for Venezuelans?
That's a question that I think is a little bit outside of my expertise as far as the conditions for migration and deportation from the U.S. I could speak certainly to some of what you're talking about the underlying conditions, though, in Venezuela.
Well, I mean, I just want to be clear for you, maybe this will illuminate things. The TPS statute cites an earthquake as the first example of the situation in which a nation should be designated for protections. The very first. So, given everything you've laid out in the aftermath of the impact of the earthquakes, perhaps you could shed light on your point of view.
Well, again, this is an issue that doesn't fall within my area of focus as an analyst of international affairs and security at Heritage. So I can't comment on that. I would direct you to our border security experts at Heritage.
I mean, the Heritage Foundation has certainly weighed in on TPS and, the ability of the United States to make sure that we can keep people safe from harm and be a refuge, and have not weighed in a supportive way. In fact, the Heritage Foundation has prioritized collective punishment of law-abiding Venezuelan immigrants over the best interests of the United States and Venezuela. So your passive,
I disagree with that characterization of our work.
The truth hurts. The truth hurts. So,
It doesn't hurt, I just disagree.
But you are able to disagree, and it isn't surprising that you disagree. We need to make sure that we do the morally right thing, the humanitarian thing, and ensure that we don't deport people back to a country.
I agree.
You've outlined specifically and in detail has been devastated in the aftermath of these earthquakes.
Yeah, I think there has been significant humanitarian suffering in Venezuela, certainly from the earthquake, but beyond that, the decades of consolidation of a socialist authoritarian rule under the Maduro and Chavez regimes. As I testified as well, I think that we are seeing a shift which is substantive, not only in respect to the economy with more oversight finally over oil revenue, which the Maduro regime was...
That's the problem, is that it's been all about oil revenue and nothing else. I mean, you can hear the detailed outline of conditions on the ground, the lack of humanitarian assistance, the complete absence of transition to democracy, the continued violation of human and civil rights. Is just, I mean, state is supposed to be consulted about conditions on the ground when determining when DHS determines, that's in the statute, when DHS determines whether or not TPS is still warranted. And it's just sad that Heritage continues to be an apologist for this administration and an entity that really works against the well-being of others instead of for their well-being. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. Now I get to ask questions. Oh, did you want to say something, Ms. Deeb?
Yes, sorry, I did want to add something on migration because I think
Please.
there's a very important case. That's the flight 168, which was a deportation flight operated by Global X from Phoenix, Arizona. That deportation flight arrived on the day of the earthquake. 146 people were in that flight, 120 men, 19 women, and 7 children. We don't know exactly how many of them survived, but they were received, as any other deportation flights, they're received by SEBIN, the Bolivarian intelligence, and the HESIM, the counterintelligence, the military counterintelligence. And WOLA, as we mentioned, was there when the earthquake struck. Our president, Carolina Jimenez, who is here with us, she went to the hotel where the SEBIN was hosting these people. They were held in detention, in handcuffs, inside the hotel. of course, then the earthquake struck. We don't know how many people really survived, but then WOLA tried to access that place, and the SEBIN was keeping family members from actually trying to find their loved ones underneath the rubble. So this case exemplifies the need to protect Venezuelans from arbitrary deportations and also to establish TPS for Venezuela and hold removals. This year alone, there have been 138 deportation flights. Over 25,000 Venezuelans have been deported to Venezuela. Thank you.
I just, one just quick mention that, yes, many Venezuelans continue to face serious practical, humanitarian, and political obstacles to returning. And we think it's important that the U.S. policy should take those conditions into account and ensure the access to appropriate lawful protection for individuals who cannot safely return. Venezuela needs international protection because it's an enormous human rights crisis. That's important to understand, not just for the United States, also for the region. Give that protection for Venezuela is something based in the crisis that is enormous, as is a human rights and humanitarian and political crisis.
Thank you. And we have a TPS for Venezuelans legislation, discharge petition that we need our Republican colleagues to join us in signing, and could benefit from many more Democrats signing it as well. And we'll continue to push in every way possible to ensure that Venezuelans who are here to make sure that not only they can find a better way of life for themselves and their families, but continue to seek protection from the brutal abuses of the regime that is still in power, and now the absolute humanitarian disaster that has befallen Venezuelans, that cries out for the continuation of TPS, which is literally in the control of the President of the United States. He could change that today and refuses. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me echo that on TPS. Believe it or not, before I was a member of Congress, I worked up here as a congressional aide to Congressman Joe Moakley, who used to be the chair of the Rules Committee, whose portrait is in the back there. And he is the author of the TPS statute. And the whole point of it was to provide people temporary protection because of political circumstances in a particular country where it might be unsafe and unwise for them to return, or because of natural disasters like earthquakes. And Venezuela right now kind of fits both categories. And so it's due to expire, I think, on October 2nd. It ought to be extended because it's the right and the decent thing to do. It had nothing to do with, whether you like Trump or don't like Trump or anything like that. It's like, this is about the people whose lives might be in danger if they are returned or who go back to an uncertain future. So hopefully we can do something in Congress. Hopefully the president will do the right thing. So with enough pressure, he might change. So thank you.
Excuse me, I just want to mention that 600,000 Venezuelans are right now at risk of immediate deportation, and the State Department just asked the Supreme Court to basically revert protections on Venezuela who are on TPS.
Yeah,
so this is like very urgent. Also, because there is no coherence, if we are in a moment of recovery and stability in Venezuela, and we cannot even hold elections in Venezuela, how can we continue to deport Venezuelans to Venezuela?
No, I agree. And look, our policy. One of the aggravating things about Washington is sometimes the rhetoric doesn't match the actions. And I'm not just talking about immigration. I'm talking about human rights, our commitment to democracy. We say things, we always don't follow through. And kind of that's one of the reasons why we're doing this hearing. But thank you very much. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this hearing is because we wanted to elevate the voices with a stake in Venezuela. And can those on the panel and those in the room who were born or raised in Venezuela raise your hand? Okay, well, let me ask this. For all the witnesses here, let me just ask, this is a yes or no question. These aren't trick questions, but yes or no questions. Yes or no? Do the natural resources of Venezuela belong to the people of Venezuela? I could begin with Ms. Rodriguez.
You mean right now and the fact?
Wait, well, the question is whether they should. Yeah. I'm just asking that, yeah. I mean, let me, I just want to get the record straight here. Ms. Rodriguez? Did she hear that? I don't know if, yeah. Well, I'll go back to her at the end, but why don't we begin with Ms. Borge? Do the natural resources of Venezuela belong to the people of Venezuela? Is that, should they be, is that the way we want to believe that the thing should be?
The recovery of the
Right,
country.
okay. Ms. Deeb?
Yes, under Article 12 of the Venezuelan Constitution, and also in the executive order from January 9th, it also recognizes that.
Ms. Roby?
Yes, of course.
Mr. Martinez Fernandez?
Yeah, I think that's broadly true.
Okay. And I don't know whether Ms. Rodriguez heard the question or not, or? Okay, all right, we'll go back. Or then let me ask you the follow-up to that. Yes or no, can you say with confidence that the proceeds from the sale of Venezuelan oil over the last 6 months have been going to benefit the people of Venezuela? No. I mean, yes or no?
Hola.
No, in the dimensions.
No.
No, okay.
Hola.
Okay, all right.
Por
yeah,
acá.
Yeah, this is just a yes or no answer.
Sí.
Yeah.
No, and in the dimension that we need.
Right.
And
Ms. Deeb? No.
No, sir.
Ms. Roby?
No.
Mr. Martinez Fernandez?
I think it's going far more towards the benefit of the people of Venezuela over the past 6 months than it has over the past couple decades.
Okay.
Por acá, Marta. Marta.
Ms.
La.
Yeah. We're going
Marta, por acá.
Ms. Rodriguez, she's going to,
Sí. Lamentablemente no. La respuesta es no. La situación de pobreza extrema en Venezuela se sigue sufriendo enormemente y lamentablemente el dinero proveniente de nuestros recursos naturales no ha permeado en la calidad de vida de los y las venezolanas.
She said, no, unfortunately, the extreme poverty continues to be serious in Venezuela, and the money from our natural resources has not gone to benefit the Venezuelan people.
so to Ms. Roby and Ms. Deeb, this is a question for you. As Venezuela recovers from the earthquake, we continue to read distressing reports about secondary public health risks from deteriorating sanitation conditions, limited access to clean water, and disruptions to health care. To what extent is the relief and recovery effort hampered by Venezuela's governance system, and how do its authoritarian characteristics affect humanitarian response and increase risks of rights abuses or post-disaster violent conflict?
Thank you. Well, the first thing that I would address is that the humanitarian situation left this hospitals completely unprepared. There were no enough ambulance, not enough firefighters and equipment to respond to the crisis. In the first 48 hours of the response, and this is a report that came out yesterday from Transparencia Venezuela, on the first 48 hours, only 12% of the state capacity was deployed to support Venezuelans. That is why you will see over and over again that people of Venezuela said there was no state presence to respond. There have been help for from at least 29 different countries that have arrived to Venezuela, and the U.S. has pledged $386 million to the humanitarian response. There is no clarity on the fund, the oil fund that was established by executive order from January 9th. There's no mechanism to account for how much money has entered that fund and how much money has been disbursed to the Venezuelan authorities. Therefore, we don't know exactly if any of that money has been used for the humanitarian response or for recovery efforts. I should say that as long as there's no guarantees for transparency, any resources aimed at recovery or even humanitarian resources need to have robust mechanisms for accountability with international oversight, because there are no conditions in Venezuela to guarantee that that money won't go back into corruption.
Ms. Roby?
Thank you so much. Once again, I will go back to my initial remarks, and it's the fact that this compound emergency is occurring in an authoritarian context, and that changes everything. What this means is that the repressive hold and the institutional weaknesses and corruption of this regime is shaping and constraining the response to that emergency. History and research shows that a natural disaster in non-democratic settings necessarily shapes the society response and the way the society manage the risk and also the political changes. This means that society can become less tolerant of authoritarian regimes. It is hard to imagine that Delcy Rodriguez and her groups won't use these earthquakes to delay talks of a democratic transition. We are already seeing that, and this might sound legitimate in a state with a genuine rule of law, but in an authoritarian state, it is extremely dangerous. We cannot separate this emergency from the fact that it's happening in an authoritarian context. Why? Because authoritarian regimes are experts at gaining time and capitalizing on crisis, and that is precisely what they are going to do. So if human rights and humanitarian needs were ever concerns in this U.S. intervention in Venezuela, I think that this tragedy is a moment for the Trump administration to show that its interests go beyond the purely monetary. But what we're seeing right now is a realpolitik response, not a human rights approach. This is problematic. Why? Without a human rights approach, the risk for a violent civil conflict post-disaster is increasing. And this is related to the humanitarian assistance and related to the human aid that Laura was already touching upon. How are we going to control and manage that humanitarian aid is not going to be used against the population to control the population and to weaponize it for political gain? This is what this authoritarian regime has been doing all along.
This is a question for Ms. Tinio, but maybe I should ask it and then go to another question and come back, okay? And the question would be, what are the profiles of the 518 political prisoners in Venezuela? Why were they arrested and why are they still detained? Can you describe the conditions of detention? Foro Penal, another Venezuelan civil society group, lists 389 political prisoners. Can she explain the difference in estimates? And let me ask Ms. Deeb, on June 2nd, Secretary Rubio testified before Congress that the infamous detention center, I hope I pronounced this right, yeah, okay. Why don't you say that, because my English is bad.
Helicoide.
Right, okay. Was was a signal of success. Has the center been closed? And what has happened to the people that were held at that detention center since then?
Sí.
Okay.
Nuestra organización mantiene actualmente un registro de al menos 518 personas detenidas por razones políticas en Venezuela. Y esto constituye un universo humano marcado por la arbitrariedad y el dolor. Este grupo representa una realidad que atraviesa todos los estratos sociales, entre ellos 64 mujeres cuya prisión supone la separación con sus hijos y la destrucción de familias enteras. Hay ciudadanos de la sociedad civil, funcionarios, sindicalistas, personas comunes, incluyendo 23 ciudadanos extranjeros y 25 venezolanos con doble nacionalidad en ejecución de la denominada diplomacia de rehenes que incluso los Estados Unidos tuvo que enfrentar.
So our registry has that there are 518 people that are currently detained, held for political reasons in Venezuela, which is a large universe of people that are suffering, and it represents a lot of arbitrariness in terms of who has been detained. Within this, there are 454 men and 64 women, those who have actually been separated from their children and from their family. This represents a broad universe of different people from different different parts of society, from civil society organizations and public officials to unionists to just ordinary citizens. There are also 23 foreigners that are continuing to be detained and 25 Venezuelans who have double nationality, so Venezuelan and another. And this has been, in part, the detention of foreigners has been part of a diplomacy, hostage diplomacy that the Venezuelan government and the U.S. have tried to address?
La crisis que enfrenta es una emergencia humanitaria que no puede esperar. Entre los detenidos, al menos 38 personas padecen enfermedades graves como cáncer en etapa terminal y afecciones renales, mientras más de 20 adultos mayores de 70 años sobreviven las condiciones que aceleran su deterioro. Casos como el de Hermilendris Benítez, quien se encuentra postrada en una silla de ruedas y presenta secuelas irreversibles debido a las torturas y a la falta de atención médica, evidencian cómo el encierro se ha transformado en un mecanismo de daño físico y espiritual.
I think the humanitarian crisis that these people are experiencing cannot wait any longer. Of the people that are detained, 28 have grave illnesses such as terminal cancer or renal problems, while there are 20 adults who are elderly who are whose age is also deteriorating their health situation. There's the case that was mentioned of Hermilendris Benítez, who is in a wheelchair and has irreversible damage from the torture and lack of medical attention she received, which shows how being in detention has transformed not only their physical well-being, but also their spiritual well-being.
Thank you. Thank you. Steve?
¿Puedo agregar algo más?
Adelante.
A este horror, y me importa decirlo, se suma el crimen de desaparición forzada que hoy afecta al menos a 9 personas cuyo paradero es ocultado sistemáticamente por el Estado. El caso de doña Carmen Navas, quien durante 16 meses buscó desesperadamente a su hijo Víctor Quero solo para descubrir que las autoridades habían ocultado su muerte y lo habían enterrado en una fosa común, ilustra la crueldad extrema de este sistema. El fallecimiento de doña Carmen, tras cargar el peso de la incertidumbre y la verdad negada, es el símbolo más crudo de cómo la desaparición forzada se extiende como una forma de tortura psicológica hacia todas las familias. Cada uno de estos 517 personas detenidas por razones políticas cuya vida se está consumando, dejan claro cómo la libertad ha sido sustituida por el silencio y la precariedad. Gracias.
Just wanted to add that from all of this horror is also the situation of people that are forcibly disappeared. Right now, there are 9 people whose whereabouts remain unknown and where the state has not revealed where they are. There is also the case of doña Carmen Navas, who for 16 months searched for her son, Victor Hugo Quero, just to finally realize that the authorities had hidden his death from her and that he had been buried in a common grave, showing the cruelty of the system. Doña Carmen later passed away after carrying that weight with her of the uncertainty and unknown truth about her son, which I think is the crudest symbol of how forced disappearances is a form of torture and a psychological torture for all of the families. Every one of these 518 cases is a life that has been impacted in a system where freedom is being substituted for silence and uncertainty.
En cuanto al helicoide, finalmente y muy brevemente debo decir que lamentablemente esto fue respuesta a la inmensa presión nacional e internacional que se hizo, pero lamentablemente refleja una terrible distorsión de la realidad. Si bien es cierto, el centro de detención El Helicoide fue desalojado, las personas que allí se encontraban no fueron liberadas, fueron trasladadas a otros centros de reclusión en los que se encuentran en iguales o peores condiciones en las que se encontraban antes.
Just on the Helicoide, to respond, I think, unfortunately, it's been closed in response to national and international pressure, but it reflects a distortion of the truth of what has happened, which is that the prison itself was closed or people were evacuated from there, but it doesn't mean they've been released, and they have been, in most cases, put into different prisons.
Yes, on June 2nd, as you mentioned, Secretary Rubio said this at a hearing at the Senate of Foreign Relations. On the next day at WOLA, we sent information actually with cooperation from Justicia, Encuentro y Perdón, and we sent the names of the 25 people that we had recorded that were remain in Helicoide. I should say that Delcy Rodriguez, after January 3rd, she also mentioned that the helicoide was going to be closed, and that never happened. And in fact, one of the requests from civil society has been that there needs to be measures adopted to preserve the evidence from the crimes that have been committed in helicoide. There have been 27 deaths in custody of political prisoners since 2014, and several of them have died in helicoide. So there needs to be not only, the closure of that center, but the preservation of the evidence. The announcement from Secretary Rubio caused immense suffering in the mothers and the members of the families that were sitting outside helicoide, waiting for their family members to be released, and instead of being released, they were sent, as Marta said, they were sent to other detention centers.
Let me ask, and whoever wants to answer this can. I mean, on this panel, you have a very diverse group of members of Congress. We have difference of opinion on a lot of things. I'm a Democrat, only between Democrats and Republicans, but sometimes Democrats and Democrats don't agree on everything. And one of my worries about what's happening right now in Venezuela is that it seems to me that the focus is less about democracy and less about human rights and strengthening civil society and more about business deals. I mean, Secretary Rubio and Delcy Rodriguez have a close relationship. I mean, the U.S. has immense leverage. President Trump wrote, and I quote, "Delcy Rodriguez, who is the president of Venezuela, is doing a great job in working with U.S. representatives very well." The New York Times reports that Delcy and Secretary Rubio, quote, "exchanged messages in Spanish on WhatsApp, trading gossip, birthday greetings, and selfies," end quote. And so if that's the case, then it begs the question, why do political prisoners remain in jail? And, why are we not seeing the progress toward democratic reforms that I think we all expected? And why aren't we hearing more outrage from the United States about the human rights situation in Venezuela? And I don't mean to sound cynical, but I don't think human rights is at the centerpiece of what drives this administration, not just in Latin America, but in the Middle East as well. And I'm just wondering whether you are confident that, in fact, we are on a path toward greater freedom, toward releasing political prisoners, toward democratic reforms, or are we just, basically just changing the names, but there really isn't going to be the changes that I think the Venezuelans I talk to are expecting and are hoping. But anybody who, Ms. Borges?
Very short. I think Venezuelans don't have to choose between economic recovery and justice. Right. Without justice and the rule of law, economic recovery will not be sustainable. And I think we need both. And we have to work on that in a simultaneous way. Like that's I say at the beginning, we have this humanitarian, institutional, political, human mobility crisis, a multidimensional crisis, and it's important to work with all together and not think in silos. It's important to work in economic recovery at the same time is justice, institution, human mobility, and all the political crisis and elections. It's important to see in a comprehensive way this complex crisis and have an effective response. And in that response, civil society is crucial because we know we have been there all this year documenting what happened, and we know also how to recover Venezuela. And this political will should go in this holistic and general approach for Venezuelans' democracy future.
Mr. Martinez-Fernandez?
I mean, as I testified, I think that it's a priority, appropriate priority, to pursue a basic level of economic stability in Venezuela, because not only is it the demand of the Venezuelan people who have suffered greatly because of economic instability, because of the failed corrupt policies of that regime, but also because it is in reality, a major human rights issue.
Well, why can't human rights and economic rights go hand in hand? Why do
I
they
think
separate?
I think they do, I would disagree with the way you characterize and some have characterized the progress on that front, particularly electorally and on human rights. I don't think they're cosmetic. The release of political prisoners is a massive shift in recognition of the fact that the arrests that the regime has carried out were politically motivated and inappropriate, as was this amnesty. Yes, they're incomplete, but they're a massive shift in progress. Just yesterday, this announcement from Jorge Rodriguez that this working process beginning on the 1st of August, I believe, is going to be looking in conjunction with the 2015 National Assembly, setting the conditions for the restoration of elections and those democratic requirements for free and fair elections. That's a major announcement in and of itself.
I know announcements are one thing. I mean, reality is a different thing. But
Well-
I think it's fair to say, to characterize your view is that significant progress has been made, that most Venezuelans appreciate that significant progress has been made, and that you think that, the future looks bright. I mean, is that fair to say?
I am far more optimistic right now than I was in a year ago as far as the future of
Do you think
Venezuela.
human rights is a core cause of this administration?
I think that human rights is certainly a priority within the broader assessment of U.S. national interests in our foreign policy. And I think that in the case of Venezuela, though that aligns, pursuing the protections for human rights and democratic freedoms in Venezuela is, as I testified, I think the best guarantor that we do not see a backsliding to the anti-American authoritarianism.
Well, Delcy Rodriguez was a loyal political foot soldier for Nicolas Maduro since his first year in office. She served as his vice president since 2018. She headed the intelligence agency implicated by the UN in crimes against humanity. If someone called Maduro a bad name, then, or if someone called Maduro a communist or, then Delcy is one too. Can you speak to the constitutional legitimacy or not of Delcy Rodriguez and her current position? Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you wrote in 2024, I think that the Maduro regime is a criminal dictatorship, and you criticized Biden for accommodating it. Delcy Rodriguez was number 2 in the Maduro regime. She was a leader in the criminal dictatorship. And, and we're hearing from our friends in the Venezuelan community that the human rights situation and the repression and the targeting continues. Can we not criticize Trump or Rubio a little bit to say, stop being so nicey nice to Delcy Rodriguez and basically actually tell the truth about who she is and talk about our impatience with the fact that progress on human rights and on democracy and democratic reforms, is not moving fast enough, that there are too many people still in political prisons. There are too many people who have been, quote, given amnesty who really don't have freedom. I think what I'm hearing from Venezuelans, in my district and across the country, is they're really worried that, that things aren't going to get better. And I think there's more of an impatience amongst the Venezuelan community that I talk to than there seems to be in the administration and in Congress. And I guess that's the only point I'm trying to make here.
I understand. I just would say, I think that the expectations that are appropriate, I think, and desires for the full respective restoration of human rights and democracy, I just don't think that within the framework of what the U.S. has great influence now, but it doesn't have total control on the ground.
You would not agree with President Trump's statement that Delcy Rodriguez is doing a great job, would you?
I would hesitate to make that.
Okay, all right, good. Then we could agree on something. Okay. I know. Yeah, Ms. Steve. Yeah.
Yes. As a nonpartisan, As a nonpartisan independent organization, I do want to give a word of caution of the U.S. administration under the argument of stabilization, actually stabilizing an authoritarian government that violates human rights and that is responsible for corruption, rather than creating the conditions for long-term stability and human flourishing. What I would say regarding the CNE is that yesterday's announcement by both the National Assembly elected in 2015 and the National Assembly now is in fact a good sign that we could be going into the direction of naming or appointing new members of the National Electoral Council and going then forward to a pathway for elections. But I also want to give a word of caution because there have been 5 different negotiations in the past, some of them led by Jorge Rodriguez, who is now the head of the National Assembly, and he's the brother of Delcy Rodriguez. And I would warn also that time is not a neutral variable here. The longer the time passes, the more that it benefits authoritarians. So that is why in the midst of this crisis, even with the earthquakes, or actually because of the earthquakes and what they have unveiled, people are calling for that electoral route. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Borges.
I just
Hola.
just finish the elections. And I think elections must be the source of legitimacy for the transition. But I think it's important to understand that legitimacy requires more than setting a date. It's important to have the political components and also the technical components. Political, as all democratic actors, must be able to organize, campaign, speak freely, and participate without persecution. And there must also be an arrangement to respect the results and resolve this dispute peaceful. And also in the technical components, I think an independent electoral authority and auditor voters registers and meaningful participation by Venezuelan abroad and transparent vote counting, publication of the result of polling station, and credible international observation through the electoral cycle is something that's important in this stage. And also elections should therefore be established as a clear and measured route of transition, and not indefinitely postponed, but not rushed in a way that reproduces the failure of the past. And we think like 8 and 10 months is an appropriate time to do this.
I think Ms. Tinio wanted to say something.
Marta.
Sí, gracias. Ciertamente, y lo decía en mi intervención inicial, el que 793 prisioneros políticos hayan recuperado su libertad, aunque no sea plena, representa un alivio, por supuesto que sí. El que en Venezuela actualmente no se estén llevando a cabo, digamos, olas masivas de detenciones como vivimos en periodos anteriores, por supuesto, que es un avance que reconocemos muy genuinamente. ¿Sí?
Yes, certainly, as I said originally, the fact that we have so many people that have been released from political prisoners that have been released is a relief. And it's very important to recognize that this is an important step. But, and at the same time that in Venezuela currently, we don't have massive waves of detentions like we had before.
Sin embargo, la crisis sostenida de derechos humanos en Venezuela lamentablemente se sostiene. Y esto es así porque todas las leyes que se crearon para perseguir siguen vigentes y el sistema de justicia venezolano sigue sin independencia. Y es allí donde precisamente cobra valor que se haga un seguimiento en la designación de los nuevos magistrados del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia para que se cumpla con el estándar constitucional y en tanto volver a tener instituciones independientes.
However, as I said, the human rights crisis in the country does remain. All of the laws that were created that to repress remain in force. Venezuela's justice system is not independent. And even right now, as we are looking at a series of judicial appointments, there's a need to follow the law and standards on who is being named.
La libertad de los presos políticos sigue atendiendo a órdenes superiores y no a la aplicación de las leyes. Y es por eso que mientras estamos conversando acá, familias enteras se mantienen en las afueras de los centros de reclusión esperando la libertad de sus parientes.
Political prisoners' freedom continues to depend on decisions from above and not on laws. And even today, as we are speaking, we still have families of political prisoners waiting outside for answers.
Es urgente que en Venezuela se retome el Estado de Derecho y se produzca el desmantelamiento estructural de las causas que generaron estas detenciones. Mientras que la justicia siga subordinada al poder político, lamentablemente, pues no vamos a poder superar esta crisis. De tal manera que sí creemos que es importante que en la agenda se incluya un enfoque amplio en materia de derechos humanos. Gracias.
It is urgent to restore the rule of law and look at what continues to happen in the country. And as long as because of the situation, it's also urgent that when we approach the situation in Venezuela, we do put a focus on the human rights situation as a priority.
You've all been very patient. I just have a couple more questions. On Monday, the Trump administration announced plans to dismantle the International Criminal Court. The ICC has had an ongoing investigation of crimes against humanity against the Venezuelan government, which could result in an arrest warrant for Nicolas Maduro. I guess doesn't require a detailed answer, but the question is, should Nicolas Maduro face justice for human rights violations against the people of Venezuela? Should the United States send Maduro to The Hague to face trial if subject to an ICC arrest warrant? And does the Trump administration's attack on the ICC make it harder to provide human rights accountability for the Venezuelan people?
I can start if that's okay. So I will begin by reiterating that justice for victims, Venezuelan victims in particular, it's impossible at this moment in Venezuela. Crimes against humanity remain in impunity, as I mentioned in my initial remarks. And this is problematic, and that is why it's so disturbing to read Secretary Rubio's op-ed from Monday. Venezuelan victims of crimes against humanity at the moment only have a few options to obtain justice: the International Criminal Court and universal jurisdiction. The fact-finding mission, although it has a UN mandate to document human rights violations, does not have jurisdiction to punish perpetrators for crimes against humanity. It has done a great job, and we hope that its mandate can be renovated in October or September 2026, because it has been really instrumental to show the world what is happening in Venezuela. The question about whether Maduro should be transferred to the International Criminal Court or not, that is for the International Criminal Court and the Office of the Prosecutor to decide in the arrest warrants that they are supposed to issue. Maduro is not the only criminal, is not the only perpetrator. We hope that he faces justice, not just for drug trafficking, but also for crimes against humanity. We need to be clear about that. The narrative has been focused on drug trafficking. That is only one part of the story. But victims of crimes against humanity remain awaiting justice. Those crimes against humanity remain in impunity. And while there is impunity, there cannot be a real transition either. Part of having a transition is having accountability, or at the very least, talks of accountability. And one of the things that go together with your last questions, we don't hear talks about accountability. We're not hearing the Trump administration talking about accountability, and that is extremely important. So when we hear Secretary Rubio, the State Department, talking about dismantling an established international institution, it is at the very least disturbing. My question for this commission and for Congress would be, where does that authority stem from to dismantle an established international institution recognized by 125 free and sovereign states? This is an affront to international law, to the international system of justice, but also to victims and survivors, and specifically to Venezuelan victims and survivors who are counting on that institution to receive justice. In 2023, Pretrial Chamber 1 asked victims and survivors to offer their views and observations for crimes against humanity in Venezuela. Do you know how many victims submitted their observations? Almost 9,000 victims of crimes against humanity in Venezuela. Why is the United States attacking and trying to destroy the international system of justice? This is a court of last resort created to hold accountable perpetrators of the gravest crimes in the world. When the domestic systems are unable and unwilling to hold them accountable. And that is precisely the case in Venezuela. While this regime remains in place, while Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello remain at the head of the state, there will be no justice in Venezuela. Why is the United States wanting to dismantle the International Criminal Court?
That's a good question, but I think...
Yeah, I think the ICC has been worse than useless as far as confronting the crisis in Venezuela. It has created, if anything, an illusion of potential accountability for Maduro and for others who carried out these crimes against humanity, but with no realistic path to actually seeing that accountability. And we never saw it for years of processes going through the ICC. And if anything, it has served to reduce pressure. It's never actually confronted Nicolas Maduro or the Cuban regime, Nicaragua, the regime as well. You know, these are entities that have just been proven, I think, within the context of the Venezuela crisis, to just be completely ineffective as far as...
I think it's weak because we've made it weak, and we've chose to make it weak, which I think is unfortunate. But do you want to?
And I know sometimes it's frustrating to talk about the international mechanism, but I think Venezuela is a very good example of, in a crisis without institutionality, how the international mechanisms of human rights protection have worked, and the work with civil society documenting and for the victims seeing their cases being heard for this mechanism, the fact-finding mission, the High Commissioner, and also the Inter-American system has been so important for in this moment that we don't have internal mechanisms for justice. And all the work that we have been doing with the recommendation, with the cases, with the documentation is going to be so important for justice, for democracy, and for truth, and for reconciliation, and for the stage of the justice transitional.
I'm going to let everybody, have a final word, but I just want to have a final word before I give you your final word. I really believe, and I wish this were the case, and it's not just this administration, but it's been previous administrations, both Democrats and Republicans. I really wish there was a greater focus on human rights as kind of the centerpiece of our foreign policy. And because I think that's what matters most, and quite frankly, if we did and we could make a difference in that area, it would improve the quality of life for the people we say we care about. And I worry that human rights has become less of a focus. In fact, even under this administration, we're removing the words human rights from, documents and legislation, and it's like why? And we have this argument, what are human rights? And I mean, it's like unbelievable we're having this conversation. And I'm somebody, and I know that I have people on both sides of the aisle who disagree with me. I'm not a big fan of sectoral sanctions. We've heard Cuba invoked several times here. We have had harsh sanctions on Cuba since I was like a little boy. And the only people that have suffered are the Cuban people. And I saw a little bit of hope when Obama was president and we began to open things up a little bit. There was more economic activity. The quality of life for Cubans was increasing, and political space against the wishes of the Cuban government was being forced open because there were too many people watching. And now we've gone in the reverse direction. And not only do we have blanket sanctions, we're basically putting pressure on every other country in the world to not send food to Cuba, to not send medicine to Cuba, to not send oil to Cuba. I just talked to a delegation of members of Congress who went down there who visited a hospital where people are manually keeping people alive with ventilators by hand because the electricity's out. And I don't know how in the world that is going to, I mean, it just hasn't changed realities. I don't know how that helps. And I think the same for Venezuelans. I don't want Venezuelans to be starved to death because of sanctions. I don't want, you know, I want, to the extent we have sanctions, I want them to be targeted on the people who are committing crimes. You know, I don't want them on a blanket across the board that hurts the Venezuelan people. I mean, in Cuba today, the mortality rate has gotten worse significantly in the last year and a half. I mean, it's like a silent Gaza happening there. And I don't think that that's what most people in this country want. So I think we need to, everything is not just black and white. We have to look at these things very, very carefully. And I guess, you know, as I yield to you to kind of close, I mean, you know, I began by saying that we want to uplift the voices of the Venezuelan people. You know, maybe as part of your closing, you can address the question as to whether you feel the United States government is listening to the Venezuelan people, to the Venezuelan voices in that regard. You know, are our diplomats listening to the people? You know, are we trying to figure out ways to strengthen civil society? I mean, I heard a report on a more conservative news station, this is going back to Cuba, that Donald Trump's sons are trying to establish a relationship with Raul Castro's grandson about potential business deals in Cuba. Again, not about human rights, but about business deals. I mean, again, we have to get back to the focus of what this commission is about, and that is human rights. And that means the right to be able to speak your mind, you know, the right for journalists to be able to do their jobs. We still have journalists in prison in Venezuela. You know, I mean, the right to be who you are, live the life the way you want to. And I think that is the best way to ensure, you know, a better life for the people of Venezuela, to ensure a better government, to ensure more security for the United States and for the world. But in any event, so if you don't have to, but if you would like to, I will give you time to be able to make some closing remarks. So why don't we begin with Mr. Martinez-Fernandez, and we'll go right down we'll end up with Ms. Tenio, okay?
Sure. Well, I just want to, again, thank you for inviting me and organizing this hearing. You know, I'd say you asked earlier something that I think is important about Nicolas Maduro being in a U.S. prison. And I think it's important to highlight that he's in prison for his crimes against the American people in the United States. And I think that's entirely appropriate. Would that the Venezuelan system could have seen justice done against Nicolas Maduro, but that neither the Venezuelan system nor the ICC or the international system were capable of delivering accountability for Nicolas Maduro's crimes. It was the United States and the Trump administration, by acting decisively in January, that finally achieved that. And I hope that and I expect that by doing that and through the subsequent engagement and progress which is being achieved, both on democratic stability, economic stability, and human rights, we will see a condition wherein not only do we not see a return to that kind of criminality and human rights abuses, but where we could see accountability for Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. I hope to see that, and I expect to. And I will also say, you know, on the issue of sanctions, I just completely disagree about the impact of sectoral sanctions in Venezuela. You know, when we look at the migrant crisis, when that initiated, when the economic instability, the collapse of the oil sector began to occur, it was well before sanctions, and sanctions were, if anything, a late measure, particularly specifically the oil sectoral sanctions. And even then, the Venezuelan regime had direct access to Chinese and other markets for its oil sector. It was the corruption and perverse economic system of the Maduro and Chavez regimes, which led to the collapse of the economic freedom and prosperity that Venezuela once had.
Well, I would just say that sectoral sanctions didn't work. If our goal was to get rid of the government of Venezuela, that's not how Maduro left the scene. I mean, we captured him. And his vice president is now in charge. But anyway, I appreciate you being here. Ms. Roby?
Thank you so much. As a lawyer and as a Venezuelan American, I deeply believe in the rule of law and human rights. I recognize that the international institutions failed, and they failed because we had to come to a unilateral military attack to see a very stagnant situation moving. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to destroy multilateralism. What we need is bold leaders that can reform and renovate institutions that need to be reformed because we live in the 21st century. We need responsible leadership, compassionate leadership. We're not seeing that, sadly. I hope that Venezuela can enter a real phase of transition, a real democratic transition, which is what Venezuelans deserve. Not simply economic recovery, not simply economic stability. That would be disrespectful towards Venezuelans who, as I said, have been trying to reaffirm their dignity over and over again throughout the years. That also means accountability. That necessarily means the release of all political prisoners without condition, not as a mere gesture, not as a mere symbolic gesture, but as a real demonstration that the regime is losing its grip of power, that it is actually losing its capacity for institutional kidnapping. We're not seeing that. And the US has the capacity to make that happen. The US has a lot of influence and control over Venezuela at this moment. And lastly, democracy is not a favor in exchange of oil or profit. Democracy is a right that belongs to each and every one of us who live in this American continent. And I hope that the Trump administration understands that, even though the US is going through its own challenges with the rule of law. Thank you.
True. Thank you. Steve?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate your last remarks because it shows, and I think this hearing has showed the importance of having a nuanced approach to the case of Venezuela that is very unique. And I think it's valuable that Venezuela remains a situation in which there is bipartisan understanding on the authoritarian nature of the Venezuelan government. And I would like to highlight the importance, again, of combating corruption and being transparent on both sides of the aisle, especially with the oil funds. As I mentioned before, there's still no accountability on the U.S. side of things also of how much has the Department of Treasury disbursed to the Venezuelan authorities. And in the case of Venezuela, there's no public information on how much oil is being sold, what is the price of the oil, and how much has actually entered the central bank in Venezuela. So these elements allow me to close with an argument in favor of transparency on both sides, especially as Venezuela, after the earthquakes, goes into the recovery phase. There's a high risk of more corruption in the recovery phase. So I would like to close with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Borges?
Yeah. Well, protect, support, and work with Venezuelans and civil society independent. And I think we are part of the solution because we help to provide the voices of the victims, that technical expertise and independent oversight and accountability. And those are essential ingredients for any credible democratic transition. And I think it's a learning lesson for the authoritarian history of the world, like how working with civil society helped to find the solution and we hope that United States and all the countries are involved in this war for democracy and transition. And we will be a good case, a history of success, and not a failure, a protected crisis. It's important to learn this lesson that Venezuelan people and civil society independent is here to help and to provide those information to recover democracy, justice, and human rights.
Thank you. Ms. Tinio?
Marta.
Sí. Hay desafíos derivados del debilitamiento institucional, las restricciones al espacio cívico, la imposibilidad de acceso a la justicia y la persistencia de riesgos para diversos grupos de la población. En Venezuela se siguen cometiendo crímenes de lesa humanidad en este momento, por lo que creemos necesario que se promueva una participación significativa entre las organizaciones venezolanas especializadas en derechos humanos para fortalecer un genuino proceso de estabilización, recuperación y democratización en Venezuela.
There are challenges that come from institutional weakening, restrictions on civic space, the impossibility of accessing justice, and the persistence of risks for different groups within society, and crimes against humanity continue to be committed. Because of this, we think it's important to
¿Dónde está? Mándamelo.
promote significant participation of Venezuelan organizations who are specialized in human rights to strengthen a true process of stabilization, recuperation, and democracy in Venezuela.
Compartimos el anhelo de una América grande, libre y próspera. Para que este sueño sea posible, la realidad de todas las naciones que conforman nuestra región debe transformarse profundamente. En este camino agradecemos el respaldo a la causa de Venezuela, asumiendo nuestra responsabilidad histórica y defendiendo la dignidad como el bien sagrado e inalienable. Muchísimas gracias.
We share the desire for a large, free, and prosperous Americas. So that this dream becomes possible, the reality of all the nations that are part of our region should be profoundly transformed. In this path, we thank you for the support for the Venezuelan cause and assume our responsibility, historic responsibility, to also defend the dignity, as a sacred and inalienable right. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I want to, before we close, I want to ask unanimous consent to include in the hearing record statements from Survival International and the Committee to Protect Journalists. I want to also submit reports from the Kennedy Human Rights Center and Foro Penal and the Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations without objections. And I would, again, I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony. I learned a lot. I think this was a good hearing. And again, I continue to believe that the future of Venezuela should be determined by the Venezuelan people. You know, as an American citizen, I want to be able to determine the future of my country. I don't want it determined by another country. I think that's the wishes of all the peoples of every country. We want to be able to have the right to self-determination. And I want to make sure that the policies that we're pursuing here in the United States actually help the people of Venezuela, that they improve the quality of life for the people of Venezuela, that they support democratic reforms and the democratization of Venezuela, and obviously that they support, you know, first and foremost, the human rights of the Venezuelan people. So with that, I thank you all for being here, and this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.